All right. Hi, everyone. This is Pastor Mary from First United Methodist Church, and I am with Pastor Melissa from Faith United Methodist over in Freeport. Some of you know one of us. Many of you know both of us. We have a few things in common, Pastor Melissa and I. We both have an affinity for things like glitter and unicorns. And
Yes.
we both like to dye our hair crazy colors, although I don't know about you, Melissa, but mine has been shut down because of this shelter in place. So mine's just blonde right now.
Mine too.
Yeah. But we've already got a plan for what the colors will be when we can go back to colors at our salon. You do too? Yeah.
Well, actually, my stylist and I had sort of put it on pause because I started swimming. So we were like, oh, let's just wait for a little bit. Little did I know that it would be even longer. So.
Yeah. Mine, I had to cancel mine for an emergency, and then 2 days later the shelter in place started. So
Sure.
yeah, who knows what we're gonna look like when all
Yes.
But yeah, but we also share another thing in common, Pastor Melissa and I. We both grieve someone that we lost to suicide. And so we thought that we would chat about that today and what is unique about that type of grief, because there are many like us out in the world, and I wanted to share that with you. And I invited Pastor Melissa to share her experience as well, and so that you can hear two different stories and know that you're not alone. So yeah. I don't know how we want to open this. Do we want to talk about what happened or who the person is in our life, or how do we want to open that thing?
Sure. I'm not sure what the best way to do it is. I can share my experience, and my experience comes as a pastor. And doing a funeral for a 14-year-old boy who died by suicide. And walking that journey, not just with the family, but also all of the students that this person had been in contact and been in touch with. Yeah, it's I don't know what the right word is. Interesting. That just feels, I don't know, that feels voyeuristic to call it an interesting path. But it is unique. I think that there's grieving, any loss that you grieve that's a sudden loss. There's a certain, that grief takes you by surprise. But when you can't explain or have a reason for something, then it also just continues to compound that grief. And you write stories in your head or out loud of what this might mean or what happened or what it was. And so sometimes you make up stories that may or may not be based in fact at the moment.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I've not had to deal with suicide from a pastoral perspective, but I did lose my father to suicide. His situation is a little different than what we usually think of when we think of suicide. So he actually survived his suicide attempt, but his body started slowly shutting down, and he ended up dying a year later, which is not usually what people think of when they think of suicide. But it's kind of in one of those places of what else do you call it, right? And so my family and I, we have disagreements on how we answer that question of how my dad died. I have found for me, calling it what it is, his body shut down because he attempted that a year prior, has for me been the most healing and helpful way for me. And part of the reason I wanted to do this today is because in our community that I serve, we have a lot of people who die in those kinds of circumstances. It may not have been intentional. It may have been things like an overdose. It may have been an accident. It may have been, even car accidents, those kinds of deaths that are hard to explain.
Right.
In my experience, they create a different kind of and unique grief. And I apologize if you can hear my dog fussing. That's Tucker. But yeah. So from a pastoral perspective, I wonder, how did you talk with your family and the friends of this boy?
Um, well, one of the things that I said, I would say over and over, both to anyone who I was talking with, and even in the funeral service, is we didn't have a reason, and we were creating reasons, which again, some were based in fact and in experiences, and at the same time, we didn't know what was going on in his head when the act happened. Um, and even if we had an answer, even if we could say, oh, it was because of this, it didn't mean that all of a sudden then the grief stopped. It was like, oh, okay, then we're fine. If we know why it happened, oh, it's all good. That's not how grief works either. But I also think that there's a certain way that if we came up with a reason, or this is why it happened, so then how do we make sure, and how do we work on making the world better based on that? So I believe it was because he was bullied. So then how do we make the world less bullied? And what do we do in our specific corner? I believe it was because of mental health. So how do we help support our mental health community and encourage others to get the mental health that they need? I think it was because of a breakup. Okay, I mean, that's more individual, but how do we talk about love and relationships even as teenagers? So no matter what the reason that we came up with, is there something that we can do to help make the world better? Not to say that what happened was good, but can good come out of it?
Mm-hmm.
And even acknowledging within our grief, just all of the anger and frustration that we may also feel. Because I think when someone dies, no matter how they die, we often will paint their picture and their story in a very positive way. We forget all of those things that may have annoyed or bothered us for whatever reason. And we remember them in a really positive way. And when you're struggling with maybe feeling frustrated or angry at what had happened, or even being angry at the person who died by suicide, there's a feeling like, oh, but I can't be, because if I'm angry at them, then what does that mean? And how can I be angry when this is where they are? But I think acknowledging our own feelings in that is okay, and to feel how you feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. In my own experience, there was definitely, you hear your 7 stages of grief, and definitely experienced all of those. And by the way, folks, you don't experience them as stages. They come and go as they please. Sometimes you feel all of them at the same time, sometimes nothing. And they do their own thing. But those are just the 7 experiences that you experience when you're grieving. I would say for me, the 2 that I felt most for the longest period of time were very definitely guilt, right? There's a guilt attached to suicide of, what could I have done differently? And the other thing was anger, right? And and I think part of that is because it was my dad. So there was this kind of particular, why wasn't I worth living for, right? Kind of attachment to it. And then there was anger with myself for feeling that way and trying to reconcile, I'm upset with him for the choice that he made. I feel guilty for the choice that he made, and I'm angry with myself for the feelings that I have. I was a teenager at the time, so I was 18 when it happened. And so teenager into my young adult years, beginning of my young adult years, trying to reconcile that, trying to kind of create my identity as a normal young adult would. with this looming over me. The church, and particularly clergy, who helped me understand that I can't be responsible for what he did, and that the way I feel is the way I feel. You know, there's feelings, they just exist. You know, we can't control what we're feeling, and the best thing we can do is allow us to feel them, and they will take care of themselves if we let them do so. It was very helpful for me. Yeah. And I wonder too about, so you were talking about solutions that can be born, almost like, you know, how can the situation be redeemed?
Right.
Yeah. Did your church find a way to start redeeming that situation, that death?
Yeah, we did several things as a church. So what happened, and this happens sometimes, especially when a young person dies by suicide. There were several attempts afterwards of others who attempted suicide, or self-harm afterwards. So there was a series of, I think, 3 or 4 other individuals who had either attempted or something had happened. And so we responded in a few different ways. We did an anti-bullying workshop. So we invited parents and students in the community, middle school and up, to participate in our anti-bullying workshop. And talked about what bullying is and what it's not, and how to respond both in our school's official channels, and how you respond individually. We had some mental health professionals come out, and they talked about depression. We geared that again towards middle school and high school. We had several senior citizens who came out, and they said, we need to hear this just as much as the young people, because we're often isolated and depressed and alone. And so we need to do this just as much as the young people do, which is not necessarily what we expected, and also clearly what was needed. And we talked about it fairly openly. So we talked about expressing our emotions, and talked about how we were feeling, and both in the context of worship, in classes, in private conversations. We did a lot of it's okay to not be okay, and feeling messy. And personally, I sort of often have an I'll go first mentality, both in preaching and in practicing this, that if you need someone to admit that they're a hot mess before you can admit that you're a hot mess, I'll go first, and I'll tell you how much of a hot mess I am. I'll tell you that I'm feeling vulnerable, or I'm feeling afraid. If that helps you to be able to say, oh, me too, I just didn't want to say it. I'm willing to be that hot mess for someone else to feel like it's okay for them to be that hot mess too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate the I go first. I use that method too, particularly in my preaching. So if there's something that I know is difficult to preach about, is difficult for people to hear, I use myself as that example, because it helps, I find, with letting our defense and our guard down. Sometimes people interpret that as a cry for help. It's not a cry for help.
No, right.
It's not a cry for help. It's a tactic to help with vulnerability. And you know, and in this process, as a person who is directly grieving that death, what I have found for myself over the years is that I carry a lot of the weight of everything that was going on in our home, right? Suicide doesn't just happen. There's things that lead up to that. It's not a snap decision that people make. It's a process that leads a person to that point. And so I found that for myself, there were things going on in the home, in the dynamics of our family, that led to that point that I needed to work on, because I was carrying that same hurt that caused that. response in my father. And so I learned for me that the best thing to do was to learn how to feel my feelings and learn how to express them in healthy ways. And so that meant, going to therapy. That meant being honest with myself. That meant being vulnerable, which is something I hadn't learned to do. I was raised in a culture, and I don't think this has anything to do with the church I grew up in the home that I grew up in. I think a lot of it is just me, but I was raised in a culture of a good Christian person kind of names and claims the good stuff and ignores the bad. And so that's the way I grew up. That's what I believed it meant to be faithful. And after this happened, I had to reevaluate that understanding of faith and recognize that it's important to acknowledge the heartache. And when I did, I actually started reading the Bible differently and found that in scripture, there's a lot of heartache. The book of Job was particularly helpful to me at that time. The book of Psalms was particularly helpful to me at that time. And going into pastoring, it has become a really helpful source for me when people come in my office to say, hey, read this book, read this Psalm. Remember what Jesus said when he was preparing for his own death. If God feels this way, God himself feels this way, we get to feel this way. This is part of human experience. And so just in a way, it prepared me to be the pastor that I am today. It's made me a healthier person, and I would never say that I'm glad that happened, by no means. I would much rather my father be here today, but I think without that, I'm not convinced that I would be who I am as a person, as a pastor, as a wife, as myself, right? I needed that. As awful as the experience was, it was a necessary part of who I am now. So when we're working with people as clergy, I know that you know this, but not everyone does. Clergy, we're mandatory reporters. So when you're working with a person that you are suspicious might be leaning this direction, what are the first things that you do with that person?
So whenever I have a conversation with anyone, I always tell them, if it's some sort of a counseling conversation, I always remind them that everything that they say is confidential, unless you are hurting yourself or others or are being harmed. And then I will tell you before I break your confidentiality, but I may be required to. And so I sort of preface it with that. I've worked with teenagers before who have done cutting, and as soon as I realized that it was happening, that's what I said. I said, I have to break your confidentiality about this, and started with parents to say, do you know that this is happening? And how are we going to do what's best for your child? So I think I try and always say, I know that you came to me and trust me, and because of that trust, I may have to take this further, which is uncomfortable. I know there was one teenage girl that I had been talking with who, after she had confessed or shared that she had been self-harming, and I told her that we had to talk to her mom, and we worked through and got the help that she needed. But before that happened, as soon as I told her, we have to talk to your parents, it was, I hate you, you're terrible, and I'll never believe in God again. And so, even though I knew what we were doing was right, my first inclination was, oh, dear sweet Jesus, I just ruined this girl's faith, and I just tore her life apart. Well, no, it was getting her the help that she needed.
Yeah. Yeah, and as clergy, we have to make those really hard decisions sometimes. You know, I had a young man that had explained to me that he had been thinking about hurting himself and had been wondering what life would be like if he weren't around. And so I called a wellness check-in on him. And he got so angry with me that he stopped coming to church altogether. He changed churches, never spoke to me again, you know, those kinds of things. And I wonder, you know, how he's doing, and I worry about him sometimes. And if I made the right decision. But at the end of the day, you know, it's better to err on the side of caution. You know, it's unfortunate that that was the outcome of that event, and I'm heartbroken over that being the outcome of the event. But at the end of the day, you know, I, as a clergy person, have an obligation to the wellness of those who confide. And it's a difficult thing, especially, I don't know about you, but I like to be liked. You know,
Doesn't.
I don't like to admit that I like to be liked. I try to put up a front that it doesn't matter to me, but at the end of the day, it does. And so it's hard to choose doing the right thing over doing the thing that will make that person like you.
Right.
And you know, and I don't know if he was serious about those claims or not, but making them was what mattered.
Right. I've had that with when it's been suspicions of child abuse or child neglect. And I've had a couple times that I've called friends who work with children in social service. I'm like, should I report this? They always remind me that it's your job to report, not to investigate. And if you think that you need to report it, you do.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, we are on the street with the fire station right at the corner.
Oh, yeah.
So just had a fire truck go by.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me about this. And it was I appreciate hearing, you know, like I said before, I've not had to do this as a pastor. I've only had to do it as a regular person. And so hearing both sides of what it's like was helpful for me. And I appreciate your conversation.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story too.
Thank you. So for those who are from the Mendota area following our page, if you are interested in what Pastor Melissa has to offer, and especially if you live in the Freeport area, go on over. Her church has a page too. It's is it Freeport Faith? Is that the name of the page?
Yes, if you search Freeport Faith United Methodist Church, we should come up.
Okay. Freeport Faith United Methodist Church. She is a wonderful pastor and a good colleague, and I highly recommend her to you. She does all kinds of wonderful things with theologically on Facebook and other social media outlets, and she's a great resource to have. So thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.